So my name is Brooke Edmonds, and I'm in Extension at Oregon State. I'm in Lynn and Benton County, and I'm hosting these webinar series, this advanced webinar series for master gardeners, and I'm really pleased to see so many Oregon folks and then also all across the U.S. That's great. We have a great lineup, and I'm really excited for our speaker today. And my job today is basically to help moderate, and I'll be helping with the questions at the end as well. And so we'll get started. I have a little bio to read here about our speaker. So Dr. Rory McDonnell is an assistant professor in the Department of Crop and Soil Science at Oregon State University. His research program focuses on understanding the ecology of invasive slugs and snails in agriculture, horticulture, urban areas, and the natural environment, as well as developing and implementing novel strategies for the management of these pests. And so with that, we'll just have a little transition, and Rory's going to share his screen, and we'll let him take it away on his presentation. Thanks so much, Rory.
Thank you, Brooke. Hello, everybody. Just bear with me as I bring up my presentation. Okay, so hello, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be online with you all today. And big thank you to Brooke and to Mark, first of all, for inviting me to speak to you today, and also for setting up the webinar. And thank you very much. So over the course of the next 35 to 40 minutes, I'd like to introduce you all to the weird and wonderful world of slugs and snails. I'm going to start out by giving you some background information on these organisms. Then we'll take a look at some of the basics of slug and snail identification. And I'd also like to talk to you a little bit about some of the species that I've been finding in home landscape situations and how you can identify them. And as Brooke said, I'd like to finish up by talking to you about the type of research that my research team and I are focusing on in my lab at Oregon State University. And we're very interested in developing novel approaches for managing these pests. I also like to have quite interactive presentations, so I do have a number of questions embedded in my talk for you guys. We'll explain how to answer the questions when we get to the first one. And lastly, I'm going to be using the word gastropods quite a lot during my presentation. So when you hear me saying that, I essentially mean slugs and snails. Okay, so as some of you have probably picked up from my accent, I'm not from the United States. I was actually born in Ireland. I grew up in a very nice small little town in the center of the country. It's called Athlone, and it's located on the banks of the largest river in Ireland, the River Shannon. And for those of you who've been to Ireland, and you probably landed in Dublin Airport, if you made your way across to the west coast, you'll have passed through my home place of Athlone. It's slap bang in the center of the country. I went to university, the National University of Ireland in Galway, where I completed a BSc in environmental science, but also a PhD on insects that feed on slugs and snails. And that's really how I got into the whole world of malacology. And before coming to Oregon State University of California, Riverside, where my program was focused almost exclusively on trying to develop novel approaches for managing snails and also slugs in agricultural and horticultural systems. And that type of research is a primary component of my program at OSU. I think it's fair to say that I'm fascinated with slugs and snails, and over the course of human history, we had a very interesting and even sometimes intimate relationship with these organisms. So we've used them in rituals, and primarily in Pacific Islands. And believe it or not, we also use them in skin treatments. This is extremely popular in Southeast Asia. I was in Hong Kong during the summer, and there were lots of spas that were dedicated solely to people going in and allowing snails to crawl over their faces. It was really quite remarkable. And we've also used snails and slugs in lots of our art, particularly medieval art. And my wife, she's from Spain, and in that part of the world, people really like to eat snails, and they're considered a delicacy. They're called escargot. And then in other parts of the world, like East Africa, and people grow giant snails in really large numbers, and they're a very, very important source of food. A question I'm usually asked when I give talks and webinars is, Rory, how did you get interested on working on such repulsive organisms as gastropods? It's a good question. I remember very well growing up in Ireland. I had a really good collection of natural history books, largely thanks to my dad. And I remember reading in one of them that slugs and snails could crawl easily over broken glass. and they have teeth sharper than those of a shark. So when you're young, you're already interested in natural history, and these sorts of facts tend to get you completely hooked, and I've never really looked back. Today, their repulsive nature has made them something of a celebrity. And there have been many Hollywood movies and books which have had slugs and slug-like creatures as their central characters. Slugs, as well, believe it or not, they've also given rise to a number of phobias. And a quick check in the American Journal of Clinical Hypnosis shows that there have been surprisingly a large number of cases where people have developed severe phobias to these organisms. So I'm guessing if I was to ask you all, what is a slug? Most of you would tell me it's essentially a snail minus its external shell, and you'd be absolutely right. But from an evolutionary point of view, this might seem like a bad move. Surely an organism that's comprised almost exclusively of water should try and retain a shell. But when you think about it, it has a lot of advantages if you can get rid of that shell. So for example, slugs can crawl through remarkably tight spaces, since they don't have the same calcium requirements as snails, and they can also live in a much wider range of environments. And lastly, because they're not carrying a heavy shell around on their backs, they can also move a lot quicker than snails. And that can be quite useful if you're trying to escape from a predatory insect, for example. I know you all know what a slug looks like, but I do want to highlight some of the main body parts because I'm going to be mentioning them later in my talk. And also some of these body parts are very, very important when it comes to identifying different species of slugs and snails. We know that the vast majority of slugs do not have an external shell, but surprisingly, and not many people know this, many slug species have an internal shell. And this is what a slug shell typically looks like. You can see it looks like a very small oyster shell or a very small mussel shell. And it's always located in this saddle-shaped structure located at the front end of the slug. And we call that saddle-shaped structure the mantle. The mantle also has another very important feature. It's called a breathing pore, sometimes called a pneumostome. And if any of you are ever taking photographs of slugs to get them identified by an expert, it's really important that you take a photo of this right-hand side of the slug, because the position of the breathing pore and other fine details on the mantle help us identify different species. At the front end of the slug, and most of you have probably seen these, we've got two pairs of tentacles. These larger upper ones, these are called the ocular tentacles, and not surprisingly, these are used by the slug to detect light. But surprisingly, the slug also uses them to detect odors in the air, so they do act kind of like a nose. These lower tentacles, they're much smaller, and these are called the peduncular or the sensory tentacles, and these are used by the slug to taste, and so they act like a tongue. Other important features on the slug body include the keel. Now, the keel is a raised ridge that can run from the back of the mantle here all the way back along the back of the slug to the tip of the tail. At the tip of the tail, in some species, we've got what's called a caudal mucus pore. It's a large pore, and it's often filled with a thick mucus plug. And we think the function of this mucus plug is in pre-copulatory behavior. So when slugs are getting ready to mate, they chase each other around in a circle. And when the slug that's doing the chasing catches the slug in front, we see it feeding on something in this particular position, and we think it's the mucus plug. For me, the tubercles, these look like the building bricks of the body. And then just in case these creatures weren't weird enough, and when slugs and snails are getting ready to mate, and the genitalia literally fall out of the sides of their heads and through this genital pore. Now, it's the structure of these genitalia are extremely important when it comes to identifying some species of slugs and snails. And we don't have time to get into that today. And if there's any of you who would like some literature on it, I'm more than happy to send it to you. So please feel free to send me an email. When it comes to snails, again, I know you all know what they look like, but I do want to highlight again some of the body parts. The vast majority of snails do have more or less the same body features as slugs. So for example, you can see they've got a mantle. It's located under the shell. It's not as obvious as in slugs. They also have a pneumostome or breathing pore, upper ocular tentacles, and also lower sensory tentacles. But the most striking difference between slugs and snails, obviously, is that snails have a very, very obvious external shell. Now, that shell can take on a real huge variety of forms, but there are three primary forms that it can take. And we've got long, slender, and cone-like shells, like in this species, it's called Testacella acuta. It's a major pest in cereal crops in Australia. It can be more globular, like in this nice looking snail is called Tiba pisana. Again, this snail is supposedly very delicious to eat. It's also a pest in Australia. And then it can even be turret-like, like in this species of Succinella. Okay, I guess one of the primary reasons we've all gathered online here today is that slugs and snails are most famous for being pests. And they act as pests on a number of different levels. Firstly, many species, they're direct pests of agriculture, horticulture, urban areas, suburban areas, natural areas, and the interface of these systems as well. In fact, the vast majority of plants that we grow, be it food crops or even plants that we use for aesthetic purposes around our homes, are fed on by slugs and snails. So you could say we're really in a constant battle with these organisms, and it's really a battle that we're having difficulty winning. And slugs in particular, they're also vector many damaging plant diseases, including carrot licorice rot and brassica darkleaf spot, and they can transmit human pathogens as well. Some of you may remember about 10 years ago, there was a highly publicized recall of fecally contaminated spinach and other salad crops that had been grown throughout California. Well, slugs are thought to have been partially responsible for this recall because us scientists think they were helping to transport the bacteria from one plant to another. The story doesn't end there though. Slugs and snails, they also cause aesthetic damage to plants by depositing mucus trails and feces, and that greatly reduces the market value of produce. And one of the things I've been doing since I came to the United States about 10 years ago is trying to get a handle on what species are causing the most damage throughout the nation. Not surprisingly, it appears to be the invasives, and the vast majority of these are accidental introductions from Europe. And many of these accidentally hitchhiked here, I would say most on imported shipments of plants, and others on imported shipments of tiles from the Mediterranean region, particularly Italy, and then others still on military equipment that's been brought back to the United States from military bases in places like Germany, Spain, Italy, and also France. As much as I'd like to, we simply don't have time to go through each and every single one of these species with you today. So what I've decided to do is to talk to you about some of the more interesting and some of the more important ones that we've been encountering in home landscapes. And I'd like to tie that in with some survey questions. The first question I have for you guys is I'd like to know how confident you are that you can correctly identify different species of slugs and snails in your home landscape. So if you only know it's a slug or a snail, then you take the first option. If you know 1 or 2 species, you'd go with the second option. 3 to 5 would be the third option. 6 to 10, fourth option. And if you know more than 10 species, well then you should probably be giving this webinar with me. That's a pretty remarkable feat, but you would select option 5 for that.
Okay, I've got that poll launched, folks. We're going to move through these. We've got a number of these we're going to do, so be on your toes as we move through these, but we'll probably give you 5 or 10 seconds for each one. So I'm going to end that poll now. And Rory, can you see those?
I can, thank you, Mark. Great. Okay, that's interesting. So most of you are only confident you know it's a slug or a snail, 73%. 1 or 2 reckon you know 1 or 2 species. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to test you to see how many species of slugs and snails you know. First thing I'd like you to try and identify is this snail species here. And if you think it's a milky snail, you would press the first option, and brown garden snail second, amber snail third, and giant African snail the fourth.
Okay, just another 5 seconds.
And if this is blocking your view, it is a little box. You can probably pick it up and sort of slide it around on your screen.
Video.
Okay, and share those results.
Wow, very impressive, folks. Almost all of you got this right. Over 80% of you got this snail. And this is indeed the brown garden snail, sometimes called the European brown garden snail. And it is, without question, one of the most damaging snail species we've got in the United States. It's a major pest in plant nurseries, but it also thrives in most urban and suburban areas as well. The snail was first introduced to the United States in the 1800s as a potential source of food, but the early settlers never really developed a taste for it, and the snails ultimately escaped into the wild. And this snail has a curious habit, and it's unusual in that it likes to lay its eggs into egg nests that it creates in the soil. And these nests are usually located about 2 inches down from the soil surface. You can see one of these nests here. Here's the snail excavating it, and here it is starting to lay its eggs. And when these eggs hatch, the baby snails or neonates, they do remain inside this nest for several days. And that makes it very, very difficult to detect them in potted plants, for example, that are being shipped out of state or out of country. And because of that, that presents a real headache for federal and also state pest prevention agencies. So the next snail I'd like you to try and identify is this one. If you think it's the milky snail, you would press the first option. If you think it's the banded wood snail, you would press the second option. If you think it's an amber snail, you press the option. And if you think it's a giant African snail, you would press the fourth option.
Okay, just another 5 seconds. Looks like we've definitely got a consensus here. So, okay, and I'll share those results.
Very good. Yes, most of you got it right again. The amber snail, well done. Amber snails, these are semi-aquatic snails that like to live in the wetter parts of habitats, I would say. But if it gets too wet, they do not like that. They'll happily crawl up pots, they'll crawl up plants, they'll even crawl up on the sides of your house as well. And these snails, they really love to feed on algae, but they generally do not feed on higher plants themselves. And you can see from this photo, they've got a very, very nice amber colored shell. Another good way to identify it, at least in my mind, is that if you pick a specimen up, it looks like the shell is a little bit too small for the body of the snail. And these snails are major pests in the Pacific Northwest, particularly in plant nurseries. Okay, we're going to move on to slugs now. I'd like you to tell me what you think this slug species is. If you think it's the grey field slug, you go with option 1. If you think it's the white soul slug, you would go with option 2. Leopard slug is option 3, and the banana slug is option number 4.
Okay, the results are definitely coming in slower this time, so I think the wheels are turning, and we'll give folks another 5 or 10 seconds. Also, no consensus here, so this is
interesting.
Yeah. Okay. All right, we'll go ahead and end that.
Okay, so only the correct answer here actually is the grey field slug. The grey field slug is one of the most damaging slug species in the United States. I would argue it is probably the most damaging species. It's also a really serious pest throughout the world. Found in an enormous range of environments, and it's a major pest of fruits, vegetables, ornamental plants, seed crops, forage crops, and even grain crops as well. And if you grow plants of any kind, I guarantee you've had this slug at some stage. It's very, 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 very common. An easy way to identify it is that if you disturb the slug, and if you try to pick it up on your fingers, or if you poke it with something, and it secretes a milky colored mucus. And you can see that milky colored mucus quite clearly on this darker colored specimen. You can see the milky colored mucus between the body tubercles here. Also, one of the important things to know about slugs is that the color and the form of the slug can change dramatically, and even within the same population. This species here, you can see it's quite creamy in color. I've seen species that are almost bright white, whereas this one is much darker, but they are certainly the same species. Okay, the next slug I'd like you to try and identify is this one here. If you think it's the red slug, you would select A. If you think it's the leopard slug, you select B. Dusky slug, you'd select C. And a banana slug, then you would select D.
Okay, just another 5 seconds. Alrighty.
No, this one here is the European red slug. So 6% of you got this right. It is similar to the dusky slug, and they are relatively easy to identify, confuse. The European red slug, this is one of the largest invasive slugs we've got in the United States. It's relatively easy to identify it, and because the head and tentacles, you can see them here, they're a contrasting darker color to the rest of the body, but also this orange foot fringe here has got distinct thin black lines. This species is very common in a whole manner of disturbed habitats, including home landscapes, and it's got a really voracious appetite for living plants as well. And surprisingly, this slug is unusually common in campgrounds. And we think the reason for that is that it's been inadvertently transported from one campsite to another on the underside of tents. Also, when this slug is disturbed, it rocks its body back and forth in a to and fro motion. It almost looks like the slug is dancing. It's quite funny. Okay, the last slug I want you to try and identify is this guy here. And if you think it's a banana slug, you would go with number A. If you think it's a leopard slug, you would go with B. If you think it's a cellar slug, you would go with C. And if you think it's the banded slug, then you would go with option D.
Okay, just another few seconds. We definitely have consensus here.
Curious.
Okay. Ready?
No, this slug is called a cellar slug. But again, it's a species that is a little bit easy to confuse with the leopard slug. The leopard slug has a kind of a fleshy colored background color with black spots on it. And this cellar slug is more yellowish brown in color and sometimes yellowish green. It's got very, very sticky yellow mucus. And the leopard slug, the mucus is sticky, but it's not any particular color. And also this cellar slug, it's got petrol blue tentacles, and that's unusual in slugs. And this species really likes to live in dark, damp places, and particularly around urban homes. We found it in drainage shores and also in sprinkler valve boxes as well. Where you find one of these slugs, you tend to find a whole pile of them all huddled together in a group. In terms of food, this slug really likes to feed on dog. And so you may spot it feeding in your pet's bowl after it gets dark. Okay, another slug I just want to talk to you a little bit about is this guy here. And it's a real oddity in the American slug fauna. It's called Testacella haliotidea, and it's one of the very, very few slug species that actually has an external shell. And this slug spends most of its time underground. It rarely comes to the surface. And for that reason, I suspect that the distribution of this slug is very much under-recorded throughout North America. So if you do find a slug that looks like this, please do reach out to me. I would be very interested in hearing from you. And this slug is also a carnivore, and it feeds predominantly on earthworms. And because it doesn't feed on plants, it's usually not regarded as an agricultural or a horticultural pest. Okay, so now that we know a little bit about slugs and snails and how to identify them, I want to talk to you briefly about current control options. As most of you probably know, the mainstay of pest gastropod control throughout the world is the use of chemical molluscicides or chemical baits. There are a number of active ingredients. Metaldehyde is the most commonly used, but it can be very toxic to cats and dogs. Iron phosphate, chelated iron, these are stomach poisons, but it can take several days for slugs and snails to die. And then lastly, we've got metiocarb. And metiocarb is a carbamate, and it's extremely toxic, and it's labeled danger, and as a rescue treatment in plant nurseries that are very heavily infested with gastropods. In my opinion, I would say the efficacy of molluscicides is very, very variable, and it's heavily dependent on things like soil moisture content, soil temperature, air temperature, and even wind speed. Tillage, and this has been touted as a good way for managing slugs, and some studies have shown that it is effective, other studies have shown that it is not so effective. But with the current drive towards no-till and conservation tillage practices and for soil management purposes, growers are becoming more reluctant to use it. Other options include hand-picking, and the use of traps, and the use of barriers. And these can be relatively effective in home landscapes, but when it comes to commercial applications and commercial fields, these are pretty much impractical, to be honest. So I've got 3 more questions for you guys. Which of these slug baits do you use most often in your landscape? If you use metaldehyde, you select option 1. And if you go with iron phosphate, you would go with the second option. Chelated iron, you would go with the third option. Metiocarb would be the 4th. And then if you don't use slug baits, then you would select the 5th option.
Okay, just another few seconds. Okay.
Iron phosphate, very interesting. And usually when I use this question in polls, most people use metaldehyde, and particularly the commercial growers use metaldehyde. So that's interesting, and that the audience here today uses iron phosphate. And iron phosphate is also allowed to be used in organic systems as well. Okay, next question. How satisfied are you with the performance of slug baits? So if you're very unsatisfied, for example, if they rarely work in your opinion, you would go with the first option. Unsatisfied would be B. If you're more neutral, you could select C. And if you're satisfied with their performance, you would go with the fourth option. And then if you're very satisfied, if they work more or less all of the time, you could go with the fifth option.
Okay, well, just another 5 seconds.
Okay, that's interesting as well. Usually when I ask this question, regardless of the stakeholder group I survey, the vast majority of people say that they are more neutral, neither satisfied or unsatisfied. Okay, last question until we get to the end of my webinar is, considering the costs and damage, how would you rank snails and slugs as a pest in your landscape? So if you think they're the worst, you should go with the first option. Second worst would be the second option. Third worst would be the third. Top 5, fourth. Top 10, fifth. And if they're not in the top 10, then you would select the last option.
Just another few seconds. Okay.
Top 5. Okay, so quite the spread on this one. Most people, quarter of the audience reckon they're in the top 5, and even over 20% of you say they're the worst. Okay, that's very useful information for me. Thank you, folks. So I think it's fair to say that control options for slugs and snails are very, very limited. And even those that are available tend not to be effective all of the time. So there's really a huge need for us to develop alternative ways for managing these pests in agriculture, horticulture, and home landscapes. And that's exactly why I was hired by Oregon State University last year. Over the coming years, our goal in my lab is to investigate a wide range of novel strategies for managing these pests throughout the United States. Today, I want to talk to you about 2 of the approaches that we're looking into. And the first is the development of novel attractants, and then we'll take a look at biological control using natural enemies as well. So my past research on novel attractants is centered around one of the most damaging in the world, and it's called the giant African snail, and it is a very severe pest in Hawaii, also in parts of Florida, and in many other parts of the world as well. And it feeds on over 500 different species of plants. This snail will also try to eat stucco off your walls, and it transmits a small microscopic worm that can cause a potentially fatal form of meningitis in humans. And so all in all, this snail is really, really bad news. Although, as I said, it only appears to be present in Hawaii and in Florida, and the US Department of Agriculture have identified areas throughout the United States where this snail could become a problem in the future. And as you can see from this map, a large number of areas are at risk. And so this is a snail species that many of us may have to deal with in the future. My past research on this species, as I said, was to try and develop a novel attractant for it. And we were approached by the US Department of Agriculture to do that and to try and come up with a new management tool, essentially, to try and control it in areas where it's a problem. We felt we could get some solid results quite quickly by trying to identify a highly attractive food source. And a couple of years ago, we did identify a food extract that was really super attractive to these snails. You can see in this photo on the bottom right, and the snails are crawling all over each other, trying to get to this piece of filter paper where I placed a few drops of the extract. We also wanted to test the extract in the field in Hawaii because we wanted to be sure that wild snails would also be attracted to it. And to run these trials, I set up 96 plots like this one in the top right. And we had 48 plots for the extract and 48 for the water control. In each of the plots, we also placed a piece of cotton that we had soaked with either the extract or water. And then we broadcast some metaldehyde into the plot and because we wanted to be sure any snails attracted into the plot during the course of the night would be killed. So what did we find? Well, almost double the number of giant African snails were collected in the food extract plots compared to the water plots at both of our study sites. And we also found, to our surprise, that this gastropod is called an Asian semi-slug, also a very severe pest in Hawaii. And we found that this species also appeared to be attracted to our extract. And again, we collected about twice as many in the food extract plots compared to the water plots at both of our study sites. So this was at least pretty solid evidence for us that the extract was also attractive to wild snails. And that was an important point because sometimes us scientists, we make the assumption that what we find in the laboratory is reflective of what's happening in the field. And that's often not the case. And thankfully this time around it was, though. And the fact that the extract was also attractive to the Asian semi-slug, pleasant surprise, and not something we were expecting. And it might suggest that our extract is attractive to a wide range of different gastropod species. Interestingly, the extract also appeared to increase the efficacy of the metaldehyde by attracting the semi-slugs and the giant snails into areas where we had broadcasted. And this has obvious implications for the management of gastropods in general. So for example, if we could attract snails and slugs from distance into traps or into killing zones within fields or within crops, then it might be possible to reduce extensive broadcast applications of molluscicide, decrease non-target effects, importantly decrease cost, and ultimately increase the efficacy of existing baits. So when I started in Oregon last year, this was research obviously that I wanted to build on. And I've got a scientist working in my lab, her name is Maria Cordova, and Maria is very, very interested in trying to identify a novel attractant for this guy, the grey field slug. And remember that this slug is the most damaging pest here in the United States, but also one of the most damaging species throughout the world. Obviously, the first thing we did was we tested the extract we'd identified for giant African snail against this species, but unfortunately, the slug showed no interest in it whatsoever. Last year, Maria then finished up a whole bunch of food choice tests and other laboratory tests, and she did find a food that was extremely attractive to this slug. And it was a food that kind of surprised us a little bit. We thought it might have been something like grass seed or bear or something like that. But the food that she found actually was cucumber, would you believe? We also tested the cucumber in the field because, again, we wanted to be sure that wild slugs were also attracted to it, not just our laboratory specimens. So we set up 20 traps with pieces of fresh cucumber. You can see one of the traps here. And we had an additional 20 traps with just water. These were our control traps. In all of the traps, we did place some liquid metaldehyde on the bottom because we wanted to be sure any slugs attracted into the traps during the course of the night would be killed. Thankfully, as you can see from the graph here, the wild slugs were certainly attracted to the cucumber. We collected over twice as many grey field slugs in the cucumber traps compared to the water control traps. In this trap, we deployed it at about 8 p.m. at night. We came back the next morning at 6 a.m. and you can see there were 5 mature grey field slugs floating around in the bottom of the trap. Over the past few months then, we've been working with a chemist in California to try and figure out what is exactly contained in the odor of cucumber. And his name is Jocelyn Miller. He's a distinguished professor at UC Riverside, and Jocelyn created the odor of fresh cucumber using chemicals in his lab. And just before Thanksgiving, I received a vial of golden colored liquid in the post. And when I opened the vial in my office, and it literally smelled like somebody had chopped up about 1 million cucumbers. It was quite remarkable. And again, we wanted to test this reconstructed odor of cucumber in the field to make sure it was attractive to our wild slugs. And as you can see from this graph, and it certainly was, we collected over 4 times as many grey field slugs in the cucumber odor traps compared to the water control traps. Our ultimate goal really with this research is to try and figure out specifically what chemicals are responsible for attracting the slugs. So what chemicals in the odor are responsible for attracting the slugs. Because if we can identify those chemicals, then we can manipulate things like release rates and concentrations, and we might be able to make a super attractant for the grey field slug. Okay, so I want to move on now to biological control. Biological control, as most of you know, is the control of a pest by the introduction of a natural enemy. Surprisingly, when it comes to slugs and snails here in the United States, this is a very, very under-researched area. And that's despite the fact that slugs and snails do have a diverse range of natural enemies and that a commercially available biological control agent is currently being used throughout Europe. And that European product, it's called Nemaslug, and the active agent is a nematode called Phasmarhabdites hermaphrodita, and it's lethal to a wide range of pest slugs, but also some snails as well. The product itself, it consists of about 12 million infective juvenile nematodes mixed with clay, and very, very easy to use it. You essentially mix the clay with water, and then you apply it to the soil in your target area. The nice thing about Nemaslug is that it is only lethal to slugs and snails, and it can be very, very, very effective. For example, in the United Kingdom, slug damage to winter wheat can be reduced by up to 89%, and in the Netherlands, gastropod damage to orchids can be reduced consistently by over 95% when this product is used. So some of you are probably wondering, where can you get your hands on some of this stuff? Well, unfortunately, you can't, and Nemaslug is not available in the United States because up until recently, the nematode had never been found here. About 5 years ago, though, when I was working in California, I traveled around the state collecting slugs and snails to screen for nematodes. I started out in San Diego here, and I drove all the way up along the coast as far as Crescent City, and then down through the Central Valley back to UC Riverside. And by the end of the trip, I'd collected over 2,500 slugs and snails from 16 different species. And we kept all of the specimens in plastic containers like these in the laboratory. I passed them on to my colleague who examined them for nematodes. In total, I passed over about 700 dead slugs and snails, and of those, over 40% had associated nematodes. So it was quite a remarkable catch rate. We collected more nematodes, I should say, from specimens in the wetter northern part of California compared to the much drier south. But the real icing on the cake came for us when we realized we discovered Phasmarhabdites hermaphrodita, and that species that is being used in Europe as a commercial biocontrol agent. And this was the first time that this nematode species had been discovered in North America. Last year, we've built on this, and we actually discovered Phasmarhabdites hermaphrodita for the first time in Oregon as well. This is what a typical infested slug looks like. Apologies that the photo is not great. It was the best one I had. And this is the slug here. You can just make out its form. And the body has started to liquefy and it's started to putrefy. And there are thousands of nematodes, sometimes tens of thousands of nematodes, like this one, swimming through and feeding on the decomposing slug flesh. We do now have colonies of this US strain of the nematode in laboratories in Oregon and also in California. And we're testing its efficacy or its infectivity against a range of pest slugs and snails, but also some native species as well. And the results to date have been very encouraging. We know that this nematode is lethal to the grey field slug. We know it's lethal to the marsh slug, and tree-banded slug, and juvenile European brown garden snails, and also juvenile giant African snails as well. And all of these species are very severe pests. Interestingly, Nemaslug, the European product, will not kill tree-banded slugs or giant African snails. And to me, that suggests that our US strain might actually be more virulent or more infective than the strain that's been used in Europe. And in my opinion, I think nematodes are going to be a very important future tool for managing slugs here in the United States, and also some snails. And I say that for a number of reasons. Firstly, we know that this nematode has demonstrated efficacy for protecting crops from slug damage in Europe, and it's very likely it'll provide a similar level of protection, if not better level of protection, here in the United States. In places such as the Pacific Northwest, where I live and where slugs and snails cause the most problems, the conditions of wet weather and low light levels that help to promote really large slug populations and snail populations are also optimum conditions for these nematodes. So the climate in these areas should support biological control efforts. And then lastly, there is a very strong grower demand for new tools to control slugs, such as biological control. Demand will be a big incentive for BASF, who mass produce and market Nemaslug, to open up the US market. Before finishing up, I do want to talk to you briefly about another group of invertebrates that I have a lot of interest in. And they also do attack and kill slugs. They're called ground beetles, and there are some species that are major predators of slugs in agricultural systems. So providing suitable habitat for these insects should increase their populations, which in turn should reduce slug populations, and in turn, we should have less damage. And that's exactly what some farmers are doing in the United Kingdom. They're building beetle banks. I've got one in this photo on the bottom left. You can see it here. They're essentially raised grass mounds of bunch grasses that act as overwintering sites or refuges for beneficial insects such as ground beetles. So the farmers are essentially keeping a constant arsenal of these natural slug-killing insects on their farms. A question I'm often asked when I give webinars and when I give presentations is, do I think that the ground beetles that we have in the United States can help reduce slug populations in crops? Well, I believe that they can certainly help, but there's lots and lots of questions that we need to answer. For example, we need to figure out what species of ground beetles actually feed on slugs, and also at what time of the year they feed on these pests. And it's questions like that my research team are hoping to answer over the next couple of years. I've got two scientists, Inga Reich and Casey Jesse, who started in my group at the end of last year, and they're going to be collecting ground beetles from throughout the Pacific Northwest. They're going to take them back to the lab, then they're going to dissect out their guts, and they're going to screen the good contents of these beetles for slug DNA. Now, using that approach, we're going to be able to identify what the most important slug-killing beetles are in field crops. And our ultimate goal is to work with growers to develop a list of feasible pest management practices to help promote the populations of these natural slug-killing insects on farms. Okay, three more questions for you guys, and then I'm going to wrap it up. This first one here, I'd like to know if novel tools such as biocontrol were developed for gastropods, how likely are you to use them if they were the same price as current methods? So if you would try, you would select the first option. If you would wait for others to try first, you would select the second option. And if you would not try, then you would select the third option.
Okay, just another 5 seconds.
Great. Yeah, for me, this is a bit of a no-brainer as well. I would certainly try and give it a go, and most of you would as well. 81% of you would be willing to try it. Okay, great, thank you. And the next question, similar, if these novel tools were more expensive, if these novel tools, I should say, were more expensive than current options, more reliable control, how likely are you to use them? So if you would try them again, you press A. If you would wait for others to try first, again, you would go B. And if you would not try, you would press C.
Okay.
So again, most of you would try, some of you a little bit more hesitant this time around. Okay, and then the last question that I have for you guys is, if these tools consistently control gastropods, how much extra would you be willing to pay? If you would not pay more, you select the first option. 1.5 times as much would be option B. If you're willing to pay twice as much, it would be option C. And if you were willing to pay 3 times as much, it would be D, and 5 times as much would be option E.
Okay, just a few more seconds.
Okay, so half of you would be willing to pay twice as much. And when I ask this question to stakeholders in other groups, such as grass seed and even vegetable crops, most people would be willing to pay 1.5 times as much or twice as much. Not so many people are willing to pay more than that. So that's good information to have. Okay, thank you for that information, everybody. To conclude, I'd like to say that I personally do not believe that there is a single quick fix or a single silver bullet strategy for managing slugs and snails in agriculture or horticulture here in the US. And this is a complicated problem, and in my opinion, the key to future success will be the development of novel approaches, such as biological control and novel attractants, but using these in conjunction with existing strategies in an integrated pest management approach. I do believe that if that's the path we follow, we'll be able to make big inroads into this problem over the coming years. Just want to thank the US Department of Agriculture, California Department of Food and Ag, Oregon Seed Council and Ag Research Foundation for grants which fund my research program. Also thanks to Maria Cordoba, Matt Klein and Andy Colton, and these are researchers in my lab who do tremendous work. And also a big thanks to all of you. Hopefully there's time for questions. I'm more than happy to answer any questions you guys have. Also please feel free to reach out in the future. I've got my email address here on the slide. Also I'm on social media. There's my Twitter handle. For those of you into social media, please do reach out to me or connect. I'm going to be providing regular updates on my program over the coming years and advice on slug and snail management as well. So again, thank you very much for taking the time to log on today.
Thank you so much, Rory. It's always really exciting to sort of see this behind the scenes as this research is developing. And these really are some novel techniques. And so it's, after this sort of stagnant market for slug and snail management, to see all these exciting things come out, it's really, really great. So if folks, I see a few questions coming in. If you could use the Q&A box, that'll help us sort of keep track of the questions rather than the chat. And I did have one that went back, Rory, from the beginning of your presentation on how fast slugs can move. And so 14 miles per hour or meters per hour?
Yeah, that's a good question, Kathy. It's actually miles per hour, would you believe? It's actually the leopard slug, another species that's very, very common around urban homes. And it's been clocked at 14 miles per hour. And as I said, slugs do move a lot quicker than snails, but the leopard slug really seems to be able to motor along when it needs to.
All right, these are coming in and making things pop up. Let me see if I can find another one. So a lot of questions coming in about the nematodes and looking at safety and timelines of availability and maybe costs.
Sure.
Do you have any information? I know that you're not the producer of these nematodes. Sure. Your science will go to whoever is the company that's going to make them. But do you have any thoughts on some of this product?
Yeah, sure. And I think that is one of the big disadvantages of using the nematode is the cost factor. It certainly is not cheap, and more often than not, it will be effective. There are times in Europe when people use the nematode and it simply does not work. It is expensive, there's no doubt about it. And that's one of the reasons why we want to look at other natural enemies as well. So things like ground beetles, for example. And if we can come up with methods of attracting those into home landscapes, and they can have a really significant impact on slug and snail populations. Yeah, and as Brooke said, unfortunately, I'm not the one who makes the prices for these products, and that is BASF. So yeah, I agree, they're expensive, but yeah, I'm not sure there's any way around it, unfortunately.
Another set of questions sort of coming in about one of our sort of, I guess, home management technique is using beer traps or
yes.
sugar traps. Yes. And that's just something that's been available to home gardeners. Do you have any, I know you're not necessarily doing research into this, but any thoughts about efficacy of these or how maybe they compare to some of the products you can purchase at a garden center?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Slugs and snails definitely love beer. There's absolutely no question about that. And they're very attracted to the fermenting products from beer. You can get just as effective control by mixing water, yeast, and sugar. So you don't need to go out and waste your money on a nice IPA or a nice stout. If you mix water, yeast, and sugar together, you'll get the same effect. We did include beer. We were testing all of the other different attractants for the grey field slug, and we found that cucumber outcompeted it. So instead of using beer, you could simply chop up some cucumber and put that into the bottom of a container with some water, and the slugs would crawl in and would almost certainly drown trying to get to the cucumber. But beer works very, very well, and it has traditionally for a long time.
You feel free to, I think you can see the list too, Rory. I'm trying to look through them.
I think one of the questions that someone asked, and it's a very good question about non-target effects of the nematode, and that's a very, very important question. One of the things that we have been doing over the past couple of weeks is we've been testing how effective the nematode is to native species of slugs and snails, so things like the banana slug and other native fauna. We found that the species that we've tested it against two different types of banana slugs and a snail species as well. And we found that at least those species, there was no observed mortality, and the nematode was not appeared to be able to enter the body of those native species. And it is always a concern when it comes to biological control about non-target effects. And it's something we are mindful of, and it's something we will be investigating for sure. Again, it was another reason why we liked the idea of working on ground beetles, and ground beetles are already native here in Oregon. So by using those, you're not introducing anything new into the environment. But we are mindful of the non-target effects of the nematodes, so it's an excellent question. Let's see what else. Someone mentioned I've sprinkled coffee grounds around my garden plants with varying degrees of success. Is this because they can crawl over a glass? Coffee grounds, slugs and snails are very sensitive to caffeine. Caffeine is extremely toxic to them, and that's primarily why they do not like to cross over coffee grounds. The problem is if it rains quite a lot, you're going to wash the caffeine out of the grounds, and eventually the gastropods will be able to crawl across the grounds. And also caffeine will acidify your soil as well, so you've got to be careful not to use too much of it. So someone else, yeah, there's another caffeine question. Yeah, someone asked about the edibility of snails and which are the tastiest. That's a very interesting question. I personally do not eat snails. I cannot bring myself to eat one, unfortunately. And my wife, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, is from Spain, and she really enjoys them. According to her, two species are the most, the European brown garden snail and Cornus spursum, which is common throughout the United States. It's a major pest here. And also one called Tiba pisana. It's called the milky snail. That's also supposedly very delicious. And I would not advocate for people going into their gardens and simply eating them. Snails and slugs do carry a lot of parasites, and that can cause a lot of problems in humans if you do eat them. It's important that you get a professional to basically clear out the good contents before you try to eat them. So a question from Nancy is how much damage are banana slugs causing in our coastal areas? And that's a very good question. Banana slugs, because they're native species, tend not to be regarded as pests. But based on my experience, they'll happily come around urban homes and feed on garden plants. I would say banana slugs probably cause less damage than the invasive species that I talked about today, the grey field slug in particular, and the different Aryan species. Question is, in Alaska, we have a new infestation of leopard slugs in a small coastal town. Any ideas as how to eliminate prior to spread? From Janice Chumley. Janice, that's a very good question. I had heard about that, and the US Forest Service did reach out to me. They had invited me to go and speak at an invasive species workshop in Alaska in October, but unfortunately I couldn't make it. I had another commitment. It's very difficult to determine what can be done without seeing the problem to hand. One of the, like a good example of an eradication program that seems to be working is giant African snail in Miami. And in Miami, people are going around treating areas where they find a snail and with baits and also hand collecting. With leopard slugs, it's a more difficult question to answer. They're not as easy to find. If you'd like to contact me off list, I would be happy to provide some additional information and some resources for you. So a question from Marianne, is it possible to participate in a trial eradication program as part of your study? Absolutely, Marianne, we'll be looking for on-farm, we'll be looking for farms to participate in on-farm trials when we get to that stage. Question related to that is people are wondering how long it's going to be before these remedies come out. And that's the $64,000 question, and we don't have an answer for that just yet. The nematodes are probably going to take a while longer. We want to be sure that there are no non-target effects before we release them or approve their use as biological control agent. And the ground beetles will probably be sooner. I would say somewhere 3 or 4 years down the line. Another aspect of work we're doing, I didn't talk about it today, we didn't have time, was we're looking at plant extracts as novel molluscicides, and that work will probably be next couple of years. So if you'd like to contact me off list, we can communicate about when we think we would be in a position maybe to start some field trials. And a question from Nina, what do you know about the apple snail that is starting to invade the southern coastal region of Louisiana? Apple snails are a major threat. I would say after giant African snails, golden apple snails are probably one of the greatest threats we face. Golden apple snails are aquatic species. They live underwater and they lay huge amounts of eggs. They can get out of control extremely quickly. And there are some baits which you can specifically use to kill these golden apple snails. Drainage can also be an effective approach. If you'd like to contact me off list, I can send you some resources and put you in touch with people who work more closely with golden apple snails. What else? Does a question from John Marie, and does copper work? That's an excellent question. We have tried using copper as a barrier to slug and snail movement. If you've got particularly valuable potted plants or particularly valuable orchid, some people advocate to put a copper strip around the pot and that the snails will not cross it. Our experience is that some species will happily cross over the copper barrier, no problem at all, whereas others are reluctant to move over. It tends to depend on different species. And the whole reason copper became famous for controlling slugs and snails is because it's thought to give them a slight electric shock when they touch it. And if you do see a snail or slug, when it comes into contact with copper, at the minute it touches it, it retracts its head almost immediately, and like it has got an electric shock. So I would say with something like that, maybe test it to see if it works yourself. And we, in general, do not use copper because it's quite expensive, and we have found that it doesn't work very often. It may work for a few days, but then as it oxidizes or corrodes, slugs and snails will happily crawl across it. What else? Question is the raw cucumber better than sluggo or bear? Should we try it? Our data definitely suggests that it's better than sluggo and bear and the vast majority of other known attractants. And that is, I need to clarify that we just use that for the grey field slug and also for the European brown garden snail. For those two species, it works very, very well as an attractant. For other slugs, it may be a little bit more difficult. We don't know how efficacious it is.
So, Rory, do we know if slugs do they like IPAs, or are they more of an American lager?
That's a very good question, Mark. Super question. There's a study done in the United Kingdom where somebody tested a whole range of beers from IPAs through to Pilsners, through to stouts. You name it, they tried it. And they didn't find any beer that stood out from the rest. They found that a yeast and sugar mixture with water performed just as well. It's a great question.
Yeah, I was just thinking about wasting good beer, and it's sort of,
Yeah, it's a shame. I'm an Irishman. I really enjoy my beer, so it's not something I would advocate at all. Another question from Skip is, two snails I've seen frequently were not mentioned. Long yellow, green, and fat reddish. Are they not a problem? And Skip, if you could email me some photos of the snails, I'll happily get back to you. I'm not familiar with the ones that you mentioned. I can't put a picture of them in my head. So if you could send me some photos, I'd be happy to get back to you. A couple of people have also asked about, Nina's asked about broken and crushed eggshells to deter slugs and snails. That's a very good question. Yes, they can work, but again, they'll only work for a limited period of time, and they tend to work better when they're fresh. Slugs and snails don't like to crawl over broken eggshells, not because they're necessarily sharp, but it's that they stick to their foot, and they don't like that very much. So they will work for a certain amount of time, but then after a few days, they'll just stop working. So John Seal wondered, is the water sugar yeast mix in equal proportions? Yes, we usually just mix it in equal. We use 4 times water to 1 part sugar to 1 part yeast. What is the best attractant for leopard slugs that you know of? From Janice. That's a very good question, Janice, and I have to say I simply do not know. It's not a species we work on very often, and you could certainly try the cucumber to see if it works. And leopard slugs feed on a whole range of different food items. They're also quite cannibalistic. They'll happily feed on other leopard slugs as well. And because of that, it might be worth trying dog or cat food. And they seem like they have some carnivorous tendencies. So if you had some wet dog and cat food, that might be a good way of trying to attract them. What else? So what kind of, John Marie wonders what kind of slugs do we have in our gardens in Portland? I've a large number, John Marie. If you like to contact me off list, I can send you a free publication of a guide to the slugs of Oregon. I can happily send that to you.
Is that something available, Rory? Because we have a place that we could post some information as well, and then folks could just
absolutely. That's a good
download that. Okay.
Yeah, it was produced by the Oregon Department of Agriculture, so I can send the link to you.
Okay.
For sure.
Yeah, and then you I know we just have a few minutes, and there are quite a few other types of questions that we might not be able to get to at this point, but we can always take a look through these and compile some answers as well if we're a little bit out of time here.
So there's a lot of questions on the nematode. Another one that popped out here is Phasmarhabdites hermaphrodita in Nemaslug, the only nematode that does this. That's a good question. It's not the only nematode that kills slugs and snails. There are quite a number of them that do. We've discovered 2 other nematodes that kill slugs and snails, and in California, one of them was new to science. And there's also a species we recently discovered in Oregon. It's called Alionema, and Alionema is a major parasite of the European red slug and other Aryan slugs. So that's another species that we are looking into as well. So we're not putting all our eggs into the basket of one nematode, we're going to spread them out. What else? So it says, Sandra said that I talk mostly about slugs. Does this information translate well to snails? Right now, I've got mostly snails, don't see slugs much. It certainly does, Sandra. Most of what I talked about today is relevant to slugs as well as snails. This is, I would suggest that slugs are probably more common in home landscapes than snails. The difficulty with slugs is that they're very, very effective at hiding, and it's not as easy to see them as slugs. You generally only see slugs at nighttime or after showers of rain. But what I talked about today is applicable to snails and slugs. Someone asked about the food extract we've found for the giant snails in Hawaii. I've been warned by my collaborators not to give that information away, folks. So I'm sorry I can't. We haven't published it yet. So when that information does become available, I'm happy to pass it on to folks that are interested. But my collaborators who are in Hawaii, Florida, and California have asked me not to say it, so I'm going to respect their wishes. A good question, can nematodes be used at any time in the life cycle of a slug? And they certainly can. And we've got some data that appears to show they're more effective when the slugs and snails are smaller as opposed to larger, but they will feed on and they will attack both large and small slugs. It doesn't matter about the life history stage, and the same for snails. What else? Yeah, some people have asked about slug control in compost bins, and that's a very interesting question. And as far as I know, there's no real method for specifically controlling slugs in compost. And I think the only way really you could do it would be to try and attract them out of the compost and then kill them at sight. So yeah, other than that, I really don't know. It's a good question. What else? Janice asks, is BT effective? BT is not effective on slugs. People have looked into it as a possible strategy, but it just simply does not. It does not work. What else? John Marie wondered about tiny blue snails. I believe they're in Portland. I'm not so sure what snails you're referring to there, John Marie. If you want to reach out to me, I'm happy to try and identify them for you. What else? Another question about eggshells, diatomaceous earth from Janice. Diatomaceous earth can work, but again, it'll only work for a few days. When it rains a lot and it gets weathered, it tends to lose its efficacy. Kathy is asking, in the home garden, I like to leave leaves on the soil over the winter for mulch and soil protection. Does that promote slugs, snails? If so, what should be done to protect the soil from heavy rains? I would say it certainly does promote slugs and snails, Kathy. If you leave any sort of organic matter on the surface, the slugs love to feed on it. They like to live underneath it. They'll lay their eggs in it as well. To protect the soil from heavy rains, I'm not really sure. You could potentially work the leaves into the soil, so kind of mix them up with the soil possibly.
You want to pick just one more question, Rory, and then we'll let these folks go.
Let's see. So a good question from P. Louis. Could you discuss the most effective ways of using current slug control methods such as iron phosphate? That's an excellent question. It depends on the crop, and it depends on the area. For home landscapes, it would be important to follow labeled rate. And the best time to use any molluscicidal product, be it iron phosphate or molluscicide, is after a period of rain. So if it rains for a few days, that tends to activate slugs and snails. They become hungry, they'll feed on the bait, and then they'll go away and then essentially die from stomach poisoning. But you really want to apply the bait at a time when the slugs and snails are active. So that could be after rainfall, or it could be at dusk or at dawn. That's absolutely critical. Yeah.
All right. So we'll take a look at some of these other questions, maybe make some summaries, and we can also post some of those answers as well if we weren't able to answer your question live. I just want to thank you again, Rory, for spending this time with us. All the master gardeners across the U.S., we all really appreciate that. Our next webinar in the series is coming up February 12th. This one's at 10 a.m. Dr. Ryan Contreras from OSU is going to talk about hybridization and tetraploids and chromosomes. Oh my, understanding plant breeding for disease resistance. So check for that one. And we really appreciate you all attending. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks, folks. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks, guys.